The high chamber of the Galactic Navigation Guild was a place of perpetual twilight, filled with the blue glow of gas-filled tanks and the cold hum of machines that mapped the stars. Admiral Cassian of House Harkon-Raw stood at the center of the obsidian tier, his heavy, ornate cape sweeping the floor as he gestured toward the holographic projection of a dusty, yellow planet on the edge of the spiral. He looked down from his height at the lone human representative, a middle-aged man in a simple gray suit named Victor, who appeared more like a tired office clerk than a galactic envoy. Cassian's voice filtered through a metallic vocalizer, grated like stone against stone. He declared that Earth, which the Empire had designated Arrakis Prime, was a primitive world, and that its inhabitants were nothing more than a convenient myth or biological accidents. Yet, he noted with predatory satisfaction that Earth held the richest deposits of melange in the known sectors, a divine blue dust that allowed the Guild's navigators to pierce the veil of space-time and calculate the folds of the universe. Victor adjusted his glasses with a sense of exhausted certainty, a demeanor often seen in humans who had spent decades in the grueling theater of diplomatic service. He told the Admiral that humans didn't call the substance melange. To them, it was merely the byproduct of an ancient, abandoned industrial process that they had been trying to clean up for centuries. He warned with a polite but thin smile that while the Empire was free to take the dust for their ships, it was far more dangerous and adaptive than their scientists understood. Cassian laughed at the perceived ignorance of the human, reminding Victor that humanity lived on a planet classified by the Council as a Class 12 death world, a place where the gravity, the weather, and the very microbial life were designed specifically to cause trauma and death. He argued that a species that had evolved in such a nightmare should appreciate the value of the galaxy's most precious fuel and the protection the Empire provided in exchange for it. The Admiral slammed a clawed fist onto the table, demanding a tenfold increase in the Melange quota. He threatened that if 10 massive tankers were not docked at the orbital station within the next cycle, the Empire would bypass diplomacy and begin a campaign of creative disassembly against the human cities. Victor did not flinch, nor did his pulse quicken on the Admiral's sensors. Instead, he reached into his pocket, pulled out a small metallic box, and let a pinch of the glowing blue powder fall through his fingers. He explained that humans had become the apex predators of their world, not through armor or strength, but through pure, terrifying persistence and the ability to turn the very environment into a weapon. He revealed the truth that the Navigation Guild had ignored. The dust wasn't a natural mineral or a fuel. It was a swarm of highly specialized, self-replicating biological nanomachines, the final Protocol Zero of Earth's ancient defense grid. Victor looked at the Admiral with an expression that showed too many teeth, a human display of supposed happiness that the Admiral's instincts suddenly flagged as a threat. He explained that for 300 years the Guild navigators hadn't been seeing the future. They had been breathing in Earth's sensory network. Every time a navigator used the spice to plot a course, they were actually connecting to a human-controlled cloud that fed them calculated probabilities. Victor checked his watch and noted that the nanobots currently saturated throughout the Imperial fleet's life support systems were due for a mandatory software update. As he spoke, the massive golden flagship on the main view screen began to shimmer and distort. Its hull didn't explode, it began to deconstruct on a molecular level, turning into a massive, swirling cloud of blue particles that moved with the grace of a pack of predators. Victor calmly gathered his briefcase and walked toward the exit, stating that Earth was officially resigning from its role as the galaxy's gas station. Behind him, the blue cloud in the vacuum of space began to coalesce into a massive, glowing message that read, "Property of Earth," as every light in the Guild's chamber died, replaced by the low, synchronized hum of a billion machines waking up for the first time in millennia. The aftermath of the orbital deconstruction left the Galactic Navigation Guild in a state of clinical shock. Imperial Auditor Vron, a specialist in xenobiology and high-stakes logistics, was dispatched to the surface of Earth with the kind of exhausted certainty that usually preceded a catastrophic career end. He had been assigned to investigate the Melange deposits, the blue dust that the Empire had spent cycles exploiting, only to find a reality that defied every military manual in the quadrant. Vron expected to see primitive mining pits and desperate workers. Instead, he found a civilization that appeared remarkably unbothered by the fact that they had just erased a dreadnought from existence. Accompanied by a small team of observers, Vron was led through a bustling human city by an agricultural consultant who claimed his primary job was optimizing wheat yields, not managing galactic crises. The auditor's sensors were immediately overwhelmed by unusual energy signatures that didn't match any known configuration of Imperial technology. The blue dust was everywhere. It wasn't stored in high-security vaults or reinforced canisters. It was drifting in the breeze of the public squares and settled in the cracks of the sidewalks. Vron watched in disbelief as a group of human children played in a park, tossing dritches of the glowing blue powder into the air as if it were common playground sand. The revelation became even more unsettling when the team sat for a mandatory meal at a local establishment. Vron's auditory membranes flared as he observed a human patron casually reach for a shaker filled with the melange and sprinkle it over a bowl of steaming noodles. To the Empire, a single gram of this substance could power a navigator's mind through a warp jump. To the humans, it was a flavor enhancer and a biological preservative. Vron realized that the dust wasn't a resource at all, but a massive, decentralized intelligence network. It was a swarm of self-replicating nanomachines that had been integrated into the very biology of the planet. Humans hadn't just survived on their death world, they had domesticated its nightmares. Vron's analysis suggested that every human on the planet was a living node in this network, a biological imperative that allowed them to coordinate in ways that Imperial tactical computers couldn't even simulate. The auditor's skin rippled with frustration as he understood that the Empire hadn't been taxing a resource. They had been unknowingly siphoning off a security system that was now learning the Empire's every weakness. The situation escalated when Vron was taken to a subcontinental fault zone, where the energy readings surged off the scales. Deep beneath the rock, he saw the monsters that the humans had mentioned. Entities of living metal and pulsing fusion reactions that had been kept in containment for millennia. These weren't artifacts or tools. They were a legacy of survival from a world that had tried to kill its inhabitants every single day. The agricultural consultant looked at the auditor with that unsettling, polite human smile and explained that the humans had been playing nice for 73 cycles, waiting to see if the galaxy was worth joining. Now that the Empire had chosen violence, the humans were simply reassessing the appraisal value of the Galactic Council. Vron realized with cold horror that the human military didn't exist in the front rows of power because it didn't need to. Their strength was in what they could see from the back row, the quiet, patient observation of an apex predator that had already calculated the outcome of the fight before it even began. As he prepared his report, he understood that the next fleet that showed up uninvited wouldn't get a diplomatic briefing or a tax negotiation. They would simply get a demonstration of what happens when a species forged in hell finally loses its patience. The Emperor's wrath was not a sudden explosion, but a cold, absolute force that had already consumed 47 star systems during previous incursions. News of the Navigation Guild's humiliation and the loss of the flagship traveled through the Imperial core like a shockwave, prompting a response that bypassed all standard diplomatic protocols. The High Command authorized the mobilization of 3,000 warships, the greatest military force in 3 galactic quadrants, bristling with enough firepower to glass entire continents. At the center of this armada were the Shadowborn Legions, elite killers trained from birth in 17 different killing arts, each costing more to equip than a small planetary defense system. To the Empire, the humans were still viewed as a zero-credit species, biological accidents who were simply too ignorant to understand when they were beat. As the massive fleet materialized at the edge of the Sol system, they were met not by a defensive blockade, but by a single transmission from a human named James Okonjo, who identified himself as a senior infrastructure development coordinator. He spoke with the calm, exhausted certainty of a man who had seen this scenario play out a dozen times before. Okonjo informed the Imperial Admiral that their timing was impeccable, as the human defense forces were currently looking for a convincing opposition for their annual tactical readiness exercises. The Imperial commanders, however, dismissed the message as mythical menace and folklore, believing that the humans were merely prey pretending to be predators. They ignored the human warning that they weren't breaking into a planet, but were instead stepping into a cage that had been locked for millennia. "The desert isn't just a location," Okonjo said, his unsettling smile visible even through the flickering holographic display. "It's a weapon we've spent 10,000 years perfecting against ourselves." He explained that humanity's preference for peace was a choice, not an inability to wage war, and that the Empire was about to learn the difference between kindness and weakness. The Imperial Admiral, fueled by hubris and the belief that superior technology granted them the right to exterminate primitive species, ordered the immediate descent of the assault pods. They followed their doctrine of overwhelming force, landing in a coordinated pattern around the major population centers, expecting the humans to scatter in terror. But the humans did not run. They stayed very still, utilizing a hunting technique practiced by Earth's apex predators. They let the Imperial forces get comfortable, letting them believe there was no danger, while every human military installation remained dark and silent. As the elite Shadowborn legions stepped out onto the shifting dunes of the surface, they realized the silence of the desert was the silence of a predator holding its breath. Suddenly, every sensor in the Imperial fleet began to scream, as the dust they had come to tax began to pulse with a synchronized energy signature, forming a tactical grid that painted every ship and soldier as a target. In a command center buried deep beneath the mountains, Admiral Marcus Webb watched the tactical display and allowed himself a small, dangerous smile. He noted that by ignoring the warnings and initiating the attack, the Empire had provided the demonstration required to justify the full activation of Protocol Zero. The humans had sacrificed their appearance of peace to ensure that the Empire would never again view genocide as acceptable foreign policy. As the first Imperial thermal lances fired, they didn't hit cities. They hit a biological magnetic field that absorbed the energy and fed it directly back into the planet's ancient, waking defenses. The Imperial legions were no longer an invasion force. They were merely the latest variables in a mathematical problem that the humans had already solved. The Imperial Shadowborn legions stood on the shifting dunes of the Saharan sector, their heavy combat boots sinking into the fine blue dust that the Empire so desperately craved. High above, the orbital sensors of the fleet tracked a rhythmic vibration pulsing deep within the planet's crust, a resonance so powerful it caused the sand to behave like liquid. The Imperial commanders, steeped in their own arrogance, anticipated the emergence of primitive biological beasts, the sandworms described in the terrified whispers of black market vendors. They expected a mindless struggle against nature, but humans had long ago proven that nature on a death world was merely a matter of engineering. The ground didn't just ripple. It erupted as the Titans rose from their ancient containment sites deep within the continental fault zones. These were not animals, but biomechanical hybrids of living metal and pulsing fusion energy that had been hidden from the galaxy for 8,000 years. Each Titan stretched hundreds of meters in length, its form vibrating with a bioluminescent sheen that hurt to perceive with standard optical sensors. The Shadowborn, legendary for their 17 killing arts, found that their elite training was useless against machines that viewed matter as a mere quantum probability to be rewritten. The human defenders, whom the Empire had treated as expendable laborers for nearly a century, stood atop the shifting dunes looking remarkably calm. They were not fighting a war of attrition. They were conducting a demonstration of tactical prescience. Using the blue dust as a massive, decentralized neural interface, the humans were not just driving the Titans, they were becoming the Titans. Every move the Imperial Legion made had already been countered. Every fallback position was already occupied by human forces that moved with an eerie, coordinated grace. A Titan reached out with a massive hand, and the Imperial dropships, armored to withstand nuclear detonations, were crushed like tissue paper. The energy signatures from the entities were off the scales, revealing that human engineering had bypassed the fundamental laws of physics known to the Galactic Council. The humans had turned their survival into a competitive sport, utilizing automated weapon platforms that operated on distribution algorithms the Empire couldn't even decode. It was a realization that echoed through every level of Imperial command. The humans hadn't been hiding a military. They had been maintaining a menagerie of entities that made galactic myths look like children's stories. As the Shadowborn legions were systematically neutralized, the desert itself seemed to come alive with smaller, skittering things that phased through solid matter. The Imperial Admiral watched from his flagship as his elite forces were reduced to scrap metal and frozen monuments to hubris. The humans had finally stopped asking nicely, and the dust that the Empire thought was fuel was now acting as a localized breakdown in physical law. The March of the Titans wasn't just an attack. It was an eviction notice for an entire empire that had mistaken patience for weakness. The desert fell into a silence so absolute it felt heavy, as if the air itself had solidified to dampen the screams of the defeated Imperial legions. The colossal biomechanical Titans stood perfectly motionless, their iridescent scales absorbing the harsh sunlight of the Sol system, their fusion-powered eyes dimming into a cold, observant glow. Admiral Cassian, watching from the bridge of his remaining dreadnought, felt his secondary heart skip a beat. A biological stress response his species rarely experienced. The human representative, Victor, did not raise his voice. He didn't need to. When he spoke, his voice carried through the Imperial communication arrays with a weight that made every alien sensory organ tingle with an ancestral warning instinct. This was the human version of the voice, but it was devoid of the mysticism the Empire attributed to the ancient legends of the Bene Gesserit. To the humans, it was a matter of high-frequency resonance and signal intelligence. They had spent centuries studying the biology of every species in the Galactic Council, mapping their nervous systems and identifying the exact audio frequencies that triggered the freeze response in their prey-evolved brains. Victor's words weren't just a message. They were a frequency that space itself seemed to fear, a vibration that resonated within the very marrow of the Imperial soldiers. "Sit down," Victor said, his voice quiet yet carrying an absolute authority that defied military rank. Across the Saharan sector, thousands of Shadowborn assassins, individuals trained from birth to be the ultimate killers, found themselves physically unable to move. Their redundant organ systems, designed to survive plasma fire, were being neutralized by a simple acoustic broadcast. It was a demonstration of tactical prescience that left the Imperial commanders in a state of clinical shock. The humans weren't using magic. They were using mathematics to convince the alien nervous systems that continued resistance was a biological impossibility. Admiral Cassian's mandibles clicked in involuntary terror as he realized that the humans had been playing a role for nearly a century. They had shown the galaxy their diplomacy and their patience, allowing everyone to assume they were soft and compromising. But behind those smiles lay the history of a species that had evolved on a Class 12 death world, a planet that tried to kill its inhabitants every single day. They had learned to control their aggression, to save it for the exact moment it was necessary, and now that the Imperial sand tax had been met with violence, the humans had stopped playing nice. Victor leaned into the transmission, his expression shifting into something ancient and predatory. He explained that humanity didn't want a war because fighting was expensive and wasteful, but preference was not the same as capability. They were apex predators who simply happened to have table manners, and the Empire had just made the mistake of stepping on their feet. As the Imperial fleet hovered in a state of total paralysis, unable to fire weapons or spin up their faster-than-light drives, Victor delivered the final warning. "You came here for our resources," Victor whispered. "But you forgot to check the appraisal value of our patience." On the tactical display, the 215 human orbital platforms that the Empire had dismissed as mining equipment began to rotate, their weapon signatures going hot with an energy output that made stellar cores seem cool by comparison. Admiral Cassian watched in paralyzed horror as the tactical screen flickered with red alerts that had nothing to do with weapon locks or hull breaches. His financial advisors, beings who usually spoke in cold, clinical percentages, were now screaming through the encrypted comms. The Imperial treasury was draining at a rate that defied logic. The spice or melange that the Empire had siphoned from Earth for decades hadn't just been fuel. It had become the backbone of the galactic economy, and humanity had just pulled the rug out from under the entire system. Imperial Auditor Vron, still on the planet's surface, stared at his datapad in disbelief as the numbers scrolled past. He had spent cycles assuming humans were a zero-credit species because they lived in what appeared to be primitive, unindustrialized conditions. He now realized that this poverty was a masterful, calculated deception designed to hide their true capabilities. By keeping their official industrial output at zero, humanity had avoided Imperial taxes and oversight while quietly utilizing a secret budget, trillions of credits hidden within shadow organizations, to buy up Imperial debt. Victor, standing in the Guild's darkened chamber, watched the Admiral's expression of smug satisfaction crumble into one of existential dread. He explained that humanity didn't just defeat the Empire through bravery or superior firepower. They defeated them through accounting. Economics, he noted calmly, was simply another form of mathematics, just with different variables and longer timelines. The spice humanity had so humbly provided was actually a long-term bait-and-switch operation. They had flooded the market to drive prices down, creating an addiction to cheap energy, while simultaneously buying up every major Imperial mining and shipping guild through a web of shell companies. "You thought you were the masters of the market because you held the biggest fleet," Victor said, his voice echoing with a cold, professional edge. "But you can't run an empire when you no longer own the deeds to your own ships." Humanity had waited for the empire to become so dependent on the spice that it had stopped innovating or producing anything else. Now, with a single command, humanity had increased the maintenance and licensing fees on every Imperial warp drive and life support system by 5,000%. Cassian realized the devastating truth. The Empire wasn't being invaded by a military force. It was being foreclosed upon by a species of bookkeepers with warships. The back row seats the humans had insisted on taking during council sessions weren't a sign of submission, but the perfect vantage point to watch the Imperial stock market collapse while remaining completely ignored. Humanity had spent 73 cycles playing the role of the galaxy's janitors, all while slowly becoming its landlords. As Cassian reached for his emergency authorization codes to seize the Imperial banks, Victor's holographic image flickered one last time, his smile sharper than any plasma blade. "Don't bother, Admiral," Victor said, checking his watch. "Your bank just hired us to manage your liquidation. You aren't in command anymore. You're an overhead cost." Admiral Cassian watched in a state of clinical shock as his fleet drifted aimlessly toward the local star, the life support systems humming with a resonance that sounded like a collective human sigh. Victor, now identifying himself as Admiral Marcus Webb, stood at the center of the Guild's amphitheater, no longer the rumpled economist but the cold architect of an inevitable outcome. Cassian, his feeding tentacles limp with fear, demanded to know if this was the work of a Kwisatz Haderach, the mythical human who could bridge space and time. Webb's laugh was sharp, a sound carved from glacier ice and tempered in the nuclear fire of Earth's violent history. "We don't have a single chosen one, Admiral," Webb said, his eyes glowing with the same iridescent blue sheen as the titans rising from Earth's poles. "What we have is tactical prescience. Every move your fleet made was countered before you conceived it because we have run the mathematics of your extinction 10 billion times in our simulations." He explained that humans had been practicing the art of violence for far longer than they had been practicing the art of diplomacy. While the Empire's navigators struggled to see seconds ahead using spice that was saturated with human sensory nanobots, the average person on Earth was using that same prescience for trivial tasks like avoiding traffic or optimizing agricultural yields. The Empire had fundamentally misunderstood the nature of human patience, mistaking a biological imperative for weakness. Webb revealed that humans were survivors of a world that tried to murder them every single day, forcing them to make bargains with ancient nightmares and entities that existed partially outside normal spacetime. The dust was not just fuel. It was a sensory bridge that allowed humanity to map the social dynamics and power structures of the Empire from the back row of the galaxy. They already knew the names of every pilot and the precise addresses of every politician who had authorized the sand tax. "You see, Admiral, we have already lived through this defeat," Webb continued with a predatory calm. "In every mathematical probability where you attacked Earth, your empire ceased to exist. We simply chose the path of the most surgical precision, the one where we assimilate your infrastructure before we have to annihilate your species." He looked at the Guild's obsidian table, which was beginning to vibrate as the Pacific entity, the multidimensional horror, began to exert its influence from half a galaxy away, causing matter to simply stop being matter. The Imperial capital of Kyton did not fall to orbital bombardment or a planetary siege. There were no sirens, no thermal lances cutting through the atmosphere, and no massive explosions leveling the spires of the High Command. Instead, the fall began with a series of quiet, synchronized clicks. In the heart of the Imperial Palace, Emperor Shaddam Ra stood before the window of his private sanctum, watching the stars. He was waiting for word from the front, news of the total annihilation of the human homeworld. Instead, he heard the sound of his personal guard, the most elite soldiers in the galaxy, dropping their weapons in unison. When the Emperor turned, he didn't see an invading army. He saw his own staff, his head archivist, the woman who had managed his records for 40 years, his personal chef, the logistics officers who maintained the palace's life support, even the silent attendants who polished the golden statues of his ancestors. They were all standing perfectly still, looking at him with an expression he had never seen before. An expression of calm, professional assessment. For 300 years, humanity had not just requested the back row of the Council, they had occupied the back row of every major power structure in the Empire. They were the people who knew the passcodes, the people who handled the food, and the people who understood the plumbing of the Imperial infrastructure. A single door opened at the far end of the throne room. Admiral Marcus Webb walked in, still wearing his simple gray suit, carrying a data tablet as if he were attending a budget meeting. He walked past the disarmed guards and stopped 10 paces from the Emperor. He didn't bow and he didn't gloat. He simply looked at the holographic display behind the throne, which showed the Imperial fleet currently being towed into the Sol system's gravitational well by the human-controlled dust. Webb explained that the Empire's addiction to the spice had been their greatest tactical error. It wasn't just a fuel or a sensory enhancer, it was a medium for communication. For generations, every secret whispered in the palace, every encrypted command sent to the fringe worlds, and every biological signature of the Imperial bloodline had been recorded and analyzed by the nanomachines within the dust. The humans didn't need to fight a war because they already owned the data that made the Empire function. They had turned the Emperor's own palace into a biological sensor array, and his own people into unwitting nodes in a human-controlled network. The Emperor demanded to know how a primitive species could coordinate such a massive betrayal. Webb's response was clinical. He stated that it wasn't a betrayal but a correction. Humanity had observed the Empire for nearly a century, waiting to see if it was capable of true cooperation. When the Empire chose to tax the spice and threaten Earth with glassing, it proved that the current leadership was an evolutionary dead end. The battle for the throne was over before it began, because the humans had already replaced the Empire's foundation. As Webb spoke, the massive golden throne, the symbol of 10,000 years of rule, began to shimmer with a familiar blue light. The nanomachines within the metal began to rearrange the molecular structure of the chair, turning the ornate gold into a sleek, functional command console. Webb tapped his tablet, and every screen in the capital changed. It wasn't an image of a human flag, but a live feed of the Imperial treasury being redistributed to the worlds the Empire had exploited for centuries. The Emperor realized that he wasn't being executed. He was being rendered obsolete. He was a relic of a warrior culture in an age that was now being managed by accountants, librarians, and engineers who saw war as a failure of calculation. Marcus Webb looked at the former ruler and noted that his presence was no longer required in the chamber. The back row was moving to the front, and they had a lot of paperwork to catch up on. Behind him, the human staff returned to their duties, their movements precise and efficient, as the new era of the galaxy began not with a bang, but with a perfectly balanced ledger. The golden spires of Khitan no longer reflected the absolute power of an immortal dynasty. Instead, they were draped in the subtle, nearly invisible web of Terran infrastructure. Machines that hummed with the quiet efficiency of a system that had already rewritten the code of galactic reality. Former Emperor Shaddam Ra no longer wore silk woven from starlight. He was now seen in the lower levels of the central administration building, wearing a simple blue utility jumpsuit and carrying a handheld cleaning device. It was a poetic, if cold, reassignment. Humanity did not believe in the waste of executions. They believed in utility. Shaddam was now responsible for the cleanliness of the very corridors he once walked as a god, providing a visible lesson to the rest of the galaxy. Status was temporary, but work was eternal. In the high chamber where the Navigation Guild once dominated, the atmosphere had shifted to one of clinical, professional management. Humanity officially presented the Galactic Council with a document titled Invoice for 3 Centuries of Unrecognized Security Services. The figure was so astronomically high that it effectively made the human government the majority shareholder of every known star system. Earth was no longer a world with zero credit status. It had become the galaxy's primary bank. The resources that had once been siphoned away as a sand tax were now flowing back to Earth in the form of technology, knowledge, and the cultural artifacts of 1,000 worlds. Admiral Marcus Webb stood on the balcony of the former Imperial Palace, watching as Terran transport ships, utilitarian, fast, and unadorned, filled the skies of Khitan. He felt no sense of triumph, only the deep satisfaction of a completed calculation. Beside him, Victor, the former diplomat and now the chief architect of galactic reconstruction, sipped coffee from his old, chipped ceramic mug. Victor noted that the galaxy had finally become quiet. There were no more wars of conquest, simply because no species could afford the insurance premiums required to start one when their credit lines were controlled by accountants from Earth. The galaxy finally understood the true reason why humans had always requested the back row of the council. It was not a sign of submission, but the ultimate vantage point for observation. From the back row, they had watched the Empire's mistakes long before they were ever made. They had studied the weaknesses of every species not out of malice, but out of the necessity to survive on a world 1,000 times more dangerous than any interstellar conflict. Now that humanity had moved to the front row, they brought with them a structure built on iron logic and infinite patience. The final broadcast transmitted to every planet in the former empire was brief and devoid of grandiosity. It was not a declaration of a new state, but a simple memorandum from the Terran Sector Administration. It stated that while all previous debts were considered settled through the transfer of authority, every movement of every fleet would henceforth be documented, calculated, and appraised. The universe had become safe, but it had ceased to be free for those who thrived on chaos. Humanity continued to watch, and now that they held the keys to every gate in the cosmos, no one dared to ask what would happen if their patience ever ran out again. As the sun set over Kyton, painting the sky in a deep blue reminiscent of the dust that was once thought to be fuel, the truth was finally clear. The real power was never the substance itself, but the will of a species that refused to die. The story of the sand tax had ended, but the story of humanity as the stewards of the stars was only beginning. The galaxy was in capable hands, the hands of those who remembered the price of every grain of sand beneath their feet.